So Peng is interested in developing quantitative methodologies for the betterment of society. His current research focuses on optimization in matching markets with applications in school choice, public housing, and online marketplaces. His research on school choice has won multiple awards, including the ACM SIGICOM Doctoral Dissertation Award, the Informs Public Sector Operations Best Paper Competition, and the Informs Doing Good with Good Operations OR Student Paper Competition. Prior to joining USC, he completed a PhD in operations research at MIT and was a postdoc at Microsoft Research. We are also joined by guest John Horton from MIT. John, you want to just wave out to us? So John is going to be providing his expert comments and views throughout the talk, and he also has some stuff he wants to go over with us at the end. Okay, so and Pang has promised to have certain breaks for you to ask questions during his talk. He has these planned points in the talk when he will be sort of opening the floor for questions. Okay, Pang, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks everyone. Can everyone see the shared screen? Yes?
Yes, yes.
Great. Yeah, it's my joy to be able to share with you my latest research in this online format today. The title of this paper is Efficient Matchmaking in Assignment Games with Application to Online Platforms. Let me parse this title first. The online platforms I'm interested in are those that help customers match with service providers. And there are a variety of these platforms. Think of Yelp, Airbnb, Thumbtack, Upwork, and others. And I'll be focused on efficient matchmaking, which means help customers find the right provider at the right price while reducing the amount of time and effort needed in the search. I'm sure many of us have spent countless hours searching online for something we want, and it's a painful process. And this is a theoretical paper that uses the assignment game model of Shapley and Shubrick 1971, which is a standard model of two-sided matching with transfer payments. And the novelty here is to quantify the efficiency of any system of matchmaking using information theory. So here's the outline of the talk. I'll first give a broad overview, then go into the model and the results, and conclude with discussing the managerial insights. After each section, I will pause to check the chat for any questions, as well as give you a chance to ask questions by voice if you would like. But first, let's go into the overview. So here's my broader research agenda, which is to design optimal systems for matching in various socially important contexts, including, as Yash mentioned, matching students to public schools, as well as applicants to subsidized housing, and finally, customers and service providers, which is the focus of this paper. And here are the steps in pursuing this research agenda. The first is to document the existing inefficiencies. And in the context of matching customers to service providers, John Horton, our guest today, has already published some papers working with these major online platform, online labor markets, showing how without extra help, employers and applicants sometimes cannot find good matches on their own, but giving them algorithmic match recommendations can dramatically increase the efficiency, as well as allowing certain certain applicants to signal their capacity can greatly improve match efficiency. So the status quo without doing anything is inefficient. This paper is about obtaining a theoretical understanding of what is optimal, what's the best we can do. And in the future, I want to also do implementable prescriptions and field experiments to bridge the gap between theory and practice. Let me give some motivating observations. First is that two-sided matching platforms have upended certain industries. Uber and Lyft have upended the taxi industry, Airbnb, the accommodations industry, and Instacart, Postmates and such have upended the grocery delivery industry. However, similar success has not materialized in the home services industry and other industries. For example, the prominent startup HomeJoy, after amassing $40 million of funding and assembling an impressive engineering team, went bankrupt in 2015. Moreover, the majority of customers still rely on word of mouth in the home services industry. And the home improvement industry has the worst consumer complaints among all industries, according to the Consumer Federation of America. So there's a lot of need there in this industry. And there's a lot of platforms that are competing in this space, but they have disparate designs. For example, some platforms have customers search for providers, such as Google Local Services and Yelp. Others have providers search for customers after customers give a detailed description of the kind of projects they want to do. Examples include Porch and Bark. Other platforms have a centralized match recommendation system where customers fill out some questionnaire about what they want, and providers also fill out some questionnaire. And the platform matches customers with some providers, and the providers then contact the customers. Examples include Angie's List, Home Advisor, and Thumbtack. Finally, there are platforms that are more similar to Uber and Lyft, which has a centralized matching system with upfront prices. So you don't need to call a provider to get a quote, but you know exactly how much the service will cost when you are browsing in the beginning. And an example is Amazon Home Services, which standardize different jobs like carpet cleaning or installing an electrical outlet with upfront fees, and just match you with a particular provider. So the research question here is, why is it that matchmaking seems to be harder in certain markets versus others? Secondly, for any given market, how can a platform best facilitate matches? Which of these competing designs to choose? And the contributions in this paper to the first question is that I separate easy and hard to match markets using a robust metric. The metric is the minimum number of bits of communication needed to reach a good outcome. I'll define what I mean by good outcome later. This is a robust metric because it's based on information theory. It doesn't require strong assumptions on the platform design. So something that's optimal according to this metric remains to be optimal even if the platform changes its search interface or the order at which things happen. The contribution regarding the second research question is to suggest managerial insights for platforms by deriving near optimal matchmaking protocols. So I will be able to say for a given market, what will be a near optimal design. Before going to details of these contributions, let me first compare it with previous approaches on improving the efficiency of these matching platforms. One line of research is to run field experiments. So I mentioned these two papers by John Horton with Upwork have shown that there's dramatic gains with simple interventions. The limitation with field experiment is that it cannot quantify the potential for further improvements. There's so many things to try, we cannot try everything. A second line of research is based on search theory, which is to study the equilibrium behavior of the system after making assumptions on how agents interact and how they behave. And one paper here is the paper by Yash and Daniela here, which is motivated by two-sided matching platforms without transfers, particularly the dating markets. The limitation of this kind of work is that it requires strong assumptions on how agents behave and interact. So if the platform does something new that's not modeled, then we have to study the equilibrium all over again. A third line of research is communication complexity of stable marriages. So stable marriage is a solution concept in two-sided matching without transfer payments. And in this literature, they look at what is the minimal bits of information that's needed in order for agents to arrive at this stable outcome. So one of these papers, which is the closest to this present one, is the one with Itai Alashtaki, Mark Braverman, Yash, and I. And however, the limitations with this line of work is that the model of stable marriages does not allow for endogenous prices. Also, this literature suggests that low communication cost, being polylogarithmic in the market size, is not possible in typical markets. So it's a discouraging finding. So this paper overcomes all of the above limitations in red by adapting the communication complexity approach, this third approach I mentioned, but modify the definition of a good outcome. So I will now be studying stable marriages. I'll be studying another concept called epsilon stable outcome that I will define later. That's also very natural, and it shows that low communication cost is indeed possible in most markets. So here are the summary of results. The key question a platform should ask when thinking about platform design is, are the horizontal preferences of at least one side easy to predict or easy to satisfy? Horizontal preference means it's something that's different for every provider-customer pair. So quality is not a horizontal preference because it's common among others. But my individual tastes or my own availabilities, these are things in the horizontal preferences. Easy to predict means that based on the questionnaires customers and providers fill out when initially joining the platform knows their preferences. So an example is passengers in Uber. The Uber platform knows their origin, their destination, as well as the car type they desire. And beyond that, customers don't really care who you match them to. So that will be easy to predict. Easy to satisfy means that, that although I may have some preferences on whom I want, I'm not so picky. So an example is finding someone to install a lighting fixture. I may have some preferences on whom I would like to have in my house, what kind of electrician I'm comfortable with, but I'm not that picky because it's something standard. So if the answer to this key question is yes, I'm going to classify the market as easy to match. And if no, then it's hard to match. And what does easy to match mean? It means that the minimum number of bits of communication per agent for the market to reach a good outcome scales as logarithmic to the market size n. This is in contrast to hard to match markets in which the minimum bits of communication is between square root n and square root n log n. And this is a big difference between logarithmic and square root. And the difference is especially big in large markets where the number of agents, n, is large. And for easy to match market, a near optimal matchmaking protocol is to have the pickier side initiating contact and provide them with cost estimates. So think of Airbnb. The customers are pickier than the hosts. So have the customers browse the hosts, browse different listings and initiate contact with hosts, while the platform provides customers with some estimated costs. Now for hard to match markets, one has to do something more complex that allows both sides to initiate contact while providing more sophisticated cost estimates. I'll give examples of this later. And another protocol for certain special cases of easy to match markets, which I call thick markets, which you can think of having easy to satisfy preferences on both sides. In these markets, one can do something simpler with centralized matching. So similar to what Uber does, just match you with someone. As long as you allow both sides some veto power about whom they don't want to match with. So now this concludes the overview portion of my talk. Let me pause to see if there's any questions. Feel free to type into the chat or to just say it.
Peng, this is John. One thing I was curious about, your slide where you sort of show that even say within home services, there's actually a lot of design variation in sort of how they do it, either like which side initiates contact and sort of how pricing works. And I'm curious if you think that kind of represents kind of entrepreneurial groping towards sort of the right kind of design for that space, or whether or not you think different players have kind of migrated into different kind of sub-markets of this larger market. Say, for example, the Amazon Home Services, I think you talk in the paper about, how they've kind of focused on things that are fairly easy to describe, and that's why sort of like posted prices work. So I wonder if you could speak to a little bit whether or not you think it's kind of, we're still kind of on a path towards one design, or is it more they've already kind of differentiated themselves?
That's a very good question. So as I understand, the question is, how do I interpret this disparate designs by competing platforms? Is that the question?
Yes. Like what's your sort of explanation for why we see this variety in practice?
Yes, this will I think partly this is driven by the diversity among home services. Home services include large contracting jobs, or something like just do it, unclog my drain, something that's more standard. And so partly it's the diversity, and partly it is platforms are still trying to converge on what is the right thing to do. So if you look at Thumbtack, how Thumbtack started is where it's more similar to Porch and Bark, where customers post a detailed description about their job, and they wait for providers to read those descriptions and contact them. However, in mid-2018, they switched to something closer to Angie's List and Home Advisors, where the platform doesn't wait for providers to reach out, but simply instantly match you with some providers. And so the fact that platforms are making these large switches means that there's some kind of trial and error that's going on. And the home services space is huge. There's about estimates say this is a $400 to $800 million or $1 billion industry. And so there are many big players entering. So the pie is very big, but there's still a lot of consumer dissatisfaction. So I think it's still in the earlier stages. There's challenges to be faced, but there's definitely interest in trying to gain a bigger share of this pie.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions?
Are there other questions? Well, actually, let me ask one more question. The results on the minimum number of bits of communication per agent. I mean, is this in some sense saying there's decreasing returns to scale in these markets? And I think, I'm like the follow-up, I'm imagining the answer is that, well, there's also this kind of countervailing benefit to larger markets where you think that you can probably make better matches because you have more kind of variance in your gamma. But I think that, anyway, the question is, how should we think about returns to scale when we're in this context?
Great. This is again a very relevant question. So again, the central challenge of this paper is about market congestion, which is when there's too many, when the market is too big, what are the negative aspects? If we ignore congestion, the bigger the market, the better the matches will be. So it's all positive. However, there's evidence that this is not the case. So for example, there's a recent paper in Management Science by Jun Li and Sergey Netesin, which study natural experiment with the merger of two platforms. And they found that with when the two platforms merged, suddenly they find evidence of reduced inefficiency, reduced efficiency. So the rate of matching is lower. So somehow this congestion is having negative impacts. And so the paper is trying to quantify this congestion. And here, I'm assuming that you're reaching a good outcome. So we're trying to see how difficult is it to reach this good outcome. And so this minimum bits of communication per agent shows you when is it that congestion is fundamentally a challenging issue that you cannot do anything about. And when is it that with a smart design, you can overcome it and not get this decreasing return to scale.
Great. Okay, so I think we'll maybe just continue on then now.
Great. Okay, yeah, so after having done the overview, let me go into the model, which would make it clear what it means by a good outcome. So the general model is based on the assignment game of Shapley and Shubik. And let me first review the assignment game and then talk about what I'm adding. So in the classical assignment game, there's a set I of customers, a set J of providers, and I'll be using N to denote the total number of agents. An agent can mean either customer or provider. And these agents on two sides are interested in forming one-to-one matches. So each customer can only be matched to one provider and vice versa. And the surplus of a match, the quality of a match, depends on the benefit, Bij, minus the cost, Cij. And this overall surplus is divided between the customer and provider as follows. The customer I, when matched with provider J, will pay an amount, Pi, to the provider. And so the leftover surplus of the customer is the benefit, Bij, minus Pi. So the surplus of customer is Ui. And the surplus of the provider, Vj, is the price received minus the cost. So that's the classical assignment game. What I'm adding in this paper is this incomplete information, where I assume that the benefit term is known only to the customer and the cost known only to the provider. So finding a good match requires communication. And there's commonly known prior about these matrices B and C. This joint distribution F, I will call the preference distribution. And you can interpret this F as the platform's belief on the preferences of agents after collecting that initial questionnaire about what agents want and who they are. So formally speaking, a market is given by this tuple, customer I, provider J, as well as this distribution F. And the way I quantify the difficulty of matchmaking is as follows. This is the delta error communication complexity of epsilon stable outcome. There are two parameters here, delta and epsilon. The definition of this is that this is the minimum number of bits of communication per agent needed to achieve a good outcome with high probability, where a good outcome is defined as being epsilon stable. And this is a tuple of a matching X and a payment vector P, which induces surplus U and V described in the previous slide. And these induced surpluses of customers and providers need to satisfy the following two conditions. The first condition, no epsilon blocking pair, says that no customer and provider pair who's not currently matched will be able to gain more than epsilon each by matching on their own outside of the platform. So on the left-hand side, UI plus Vj is what they currently get. And once you give them epsilon each, that has to be greater than or equal to what they will get on their own, which is Bij minus Cij. The second condition, individual rationality, says that everyone is willing to participate at a given matching and prices. And when epsilon is 0, this is exactly the classical notion of a stable outcome in a Simon game. And so what's added here is this epsilon. And this epsilon is important for us to be able to bypass certain impossibility results encountered in previous works. And without loss of generality, to give epsilon a scale, I'm going to normalize the benefit and costs to be always between 0 and 1. So that concludes the model section. Are there any questions about the model before I go into the results?
Quick question. The B's and C's are from a general joint distribution, no independence anywhere.
Yes, so the question is about what do I assume about the distribution of B and C. So right now in this general model, they're coming from a general joint distribution. And later on, when I talk about easy to match, hard to match markets, those are essentially assumptions, additional assumptions on this joint distribution F. So in those results, I'll be making more specific assumptions. But right now, you can think there's no assumptions. They can be arbitrarily correlated in all kinds of ways.
So what does this imply for like the no epsilon blocking? Shouldn't you think of like conditioning on what you know?
Oh, yes. So epsilon outcome
Like
is conditioned on the actual realizations.
Yeah, you're using actual realizations there, but people, I mean, trading should be based on expectations, no? On given what I know, I'm unhappy, or given what I know, I'm happy.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. The way I understand this question is as follows. This is the difference between communication complexity approach and the search theory approach. In the search theory approach, we assume what agents know and try to study the equilibrium behavior of what happens when they try to optimize given their knowledge. And so there it will be important to think about these questions about what they know when making decisions. And this communication complexity approach, this is like the dual approach. This is saying, okay, I just fix a definition of a good outcome, which is this epsilon stable outcome. So the question is, what's the minimal amount of communication in order to get to that outcome? So what is the benefit of this approach? It says, suppose we can easily get to this outcome with low communication, that is ex post epsilon stable outcome. That's a stronger notion, because if it's ex post epsilon stable outcome as described here, there are two desirable properties from this. One is that the social surplus is approximately maximized. The second one is that if it's already epsilon stable, then no new platform can join in and try to steal customers because you're already doing the best. So if we can get to this very high standard of what is good, that will be very desirable. Does that make sense? So I'm going to show that for many markets, we can relatively easily obtain this ex post stable outcome. It's a stronger efficiency statement. And if you can get there, then why not? Does that address the question?
Sorry, Peng, can I ask a question? The notion of epsilon stable outcome here, if I understand correctly, doesn't promise anything about like the total welfare, right? Like I sum across all the matches, the Bij minus Cij, and I want to maximize the sum over all matched pairs of Bij minus Cij. This,
the epsilon stable outcome, the condition stated here doesn't say about welfare, but the statement you're making is implied. So you can show using LP duality for any epsilon stable outcome, if you sum up all the benefits minus cost and average it across agents, that's at most epsilon less. That's within epsilon of the optimal if you just solve the maximum matching problem. So that is implied by these statements. It comes from weak duality.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Just a follow-up. So the optimality gap will scale linearly in the number of agents, though, right? Epsilon times.
Yes. So the average welfare is within epsilon of the best possible, but the total welfare gap is it could scale epsilon times n.
Got it.
Any other questions about the model before I move on to the results? Okay, great. Okay, so now let me go over the results. So here are the summary of results slides. Again, I'm going to first talk about this first part. What do I mean by horizontal preference of at least one side, easy to predict or easy to satisfy? So a market is easy to match if the condition holds. So the horizontal preferences of one side are easy to predict or satisfy. So to make this precise, I need to define horizontal preference, easy to predict, and easy to satisfy. Without loss of generality, let's pick one side, say the providers. So the cost of a provider J for serving customer I can always be decomposed into some common terms, this alpha I and beta J, as well as a heterogeneous term gamma IJ. And I just define this gamma IJ as the horizontal preference. So something like quality of a general provider or the level of the overall cost will not be in a horizontal preference, but something that's idiosyncratic would be. And the horizontal preference is easy to predict if it's within a narrow range, given this initial information that that the platform collects about what agents want and what they're looking for. That's already encoded into this joint distribution F. So again, the joint distribution F I'm studying already encodes these initial questionnaires. So easy to predict just means that given all that information, there's relatively small amount of uncertainty about the horizontal preferences. Easy to satisfy means that for some constant D, although this gamma IJ horizontal preference may not be always within this narrow range, it is within this range with a constant probability. And this range, this underbar gamma IJ represents the lower support, so the best possible cost provider can provide. And there are also additional assumptions on the independence of these gamma IJs, as well as common knowledge assumptions. So back to the previous question about assumptions on F, so easy to predict and easy to satisfy entails certain assumptions on these joint distribution F. And the theorem is that under either of the above assumptions, the delta error communication complexity of epsilon stable outcomes scales as logarithmic to the market size n. And this is both a lower bound and an upper bound. And but the dependence, the constant depends on delta, epsilon, and d. So this is an abstract concept. Let me give some more examples. So here are some examples of easy to match markets. So on eBay, we think that sellers' horizontal preferences are easy to predict because they're essentially shipping costs. And I know the UPS, USPS shipping costs from any state to any state. Airbnb, we think the host's horizontal preferences are easy to satisfy because conditioned on them willing to pay and have a reasonable track record, hosts are not that picky about exactly who is coming to stay there. And for ride sharing, we will think that riders' horizontal preferences are easy to predict since it's just destination, origin, as well as car type. And drivers' horizontal preferences are easy to satisfy. A driver may have some private preferences about where they want to end up at the end of the day that the platform may or may not know. But if you give them a few options, they are not so picky about which particular passengers they pick up, but at least a constant proportion of the market they're happy to serve. Now, on the other hand, a market is hard to match if the reverse holds. So the horizontal preferences of both sides are hard to predict and hard to satisfy. Let me give an example. Consider this example where we have equal number of customers as well as providers and completely idiosyncratic preferences with vanishing proportion of preferred partners. So the benefit here is high with a value of 0.99 with a very small probability. And the cost is low with a very small probability. So again, high benefit and low cost is good. So the proposition is that the delta error communication complexity for finding epsilon stable outcomes for the above market scales at least as a constant times square root n. And the intuition here is that in expectation, each agent has only one profitable partner with whom they have high benefit and low cost. But they need to ask square root n partners before finding one who reciprocates interest. So finding a good match is like finding a needle in a haystack because both sides are so picky about whom they're willing to serve. It's just very hard. There's some unavoidable communication and congestion that's needed to make the search. And just to illustrate this concept, some examples of what we think are harder to match markets could be non-routine home improvement projects in which every customer's needs are unique. And contractors may have widely different estimates of the required time and cost. Similarly, when finding part-time nannies, families differ in their needs about what kind of nanny they want to care for their child and can be very picky about whom to hire. And nannies actually also have preferences on families and have different availabilities, especially for part-time nannies. Maybe only certain afternoons on certain weeks they can work. So that concludes this part about the what I mean by easy to match and hard to match, as well as these bounds. Before I go to the next part of the results, are there any questions?
So just a quick clarification about again the assumptions: easy to predict and easy to satisfy. Does one imply the other?
Okay, that's a good question. Let me go to that slide. So here, if you just look at here, it seems like this one implies the first one because the first one is very strong. It says it always within this range, and this one says that it's only within a small range with a constant probability. However, what's different here is that easy to satisfy also requires some additional independence assumptions, as well as additional assumptions on knowledge. So because of this last line, it doesn't exactly imply the first one. And this last line is important. The independence is required so that if I look at a bounded number of partners, I'm bound to find one I like, independent of everything else. But for easy to predict, as long as it's in a narrow range, it could be arbitrarily correlated with alpha, beta, with the providers, with the customer benefits and everything else. So it's the independence that's making the second one weaker. But this is definitely a harder condition to work with than the first one. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that helps. Just a follow up then, because so you're saying these variables are commonly known, like this gamma lower bar is commonly known, and then you're also saying that it can be correlated and so on. So do you mean like the realization of some joint like a vector of random variables is commonly known, or?
So these gamma lower bars are the lower supports of these terms. So it's like this is the support of the distribution.
So
does that make sense? So it's related with the assumption that the joint distribution F is commonly known. This is not a realization. It's the lower support.
Got it.
Minimum possible realization.
So the gammas are arbitrarily correlated, but they lie in this small interval, and that's enough.
Yes.
Got it.
So that's easy to predict.
Got it.
Great. Let me go back here. Any other question before I move to the next one? Let me just check the time. Okay, so the next part will be describing these near optimal matchmaking protocols. And I highlighted these two because they're related to each other, and I will talk about them together. So first, here's a near optimal protocol for easy to match markets. So one word of interpretation before I go into the details. When we do the protocol, when we talk about protocol to make the math analysis rigorous, there's a lot of details here. However, the way you should interpret this protocol in practice is not literally implementing this protocol. Since in practice, the platform chooses a design and then customers and providers participate in this platform. But a protocol incorporates not only the platform's design, but also the participation of how they participate in order to make something precise. I'm going to first give the precise protocol and then talk about the interpretation. So in this protocol, the platform first computes this optimistic cost estimate. Optimistic meaning that they're very low cost, the best possible deals you can find. Based on this commonly known information that's related with the information they collect, as well as costs for a relative few number of customer-provider pairs. This collection of cost information is used to estimate the vertical terms so that only the horizontal terms are unknown. And then after having these optimistic cost estimates, customers reach out to providers in decreasing order of the estimated surplus, which is the benefit minus the estimated cost minus the price premium charged by each provider J. And the providers are updating their price premiums based on the demand. And customers also will increment the cost estimate based on provider feedback. So think of it like an auction where the customers are bidding up the amount of profit. The price premium is like the profit of providers. And at first, they're very optimistic. They think everyone is cheap. But once they start contacting people, they realize many people are not so cheap. So they're updating their cost estimates. And customer will stop when they find a provider who can actually provide close to this the initial cost estimate they have. And the theorem here is that for easy to match markets, this computes an epsilon stable outcome with high probability using the optimal logarithmic bits of communication per agent. And the way you should interpret this protocol is it's really building a searchable directory of the providers, as well as providing cost estimates. This second step about customers reaching out and providers updating their price premium is really simulating what we would expect to happen in a decentralized market anyway. If you give people a search engine, they're going to search and look for people. And providers will be adjusting their prices based on supply and demand. Any questions here? Okay, so if not, let me talk about how this can be generalized to hard to match markets. And here, we also have the first step is also to compute a cost estimate, but this needs to be more complex. With hard to match markets, it cannot be just an optimistic cost estimate because maybe this is just very unattainable, but we want optimistic but attainable. The first equation over here says it's optimistic, meaning that with only a small chance, the actual costs are better than this estimate. So this estimate is already pretty optimistic. The second condition says that this is attainable, meaning that with at least a certain probability, you can actually find someone who's close to this good estimate. And this parameter D, you can think of it as a small number. And the second step is providers reach out to customers for which their cost is less than the estimate, and the customers update their estimates correspondingly. think of this as providers sending special deals to select customers whom they can serve very cheaply. And the third step is exactly back to before. So it's like a searchable directory of providers, and customers are just reaching out. And the difference here is now they have cost estimates that's based both on platform computation as well as providers reaching out. And the theorem is that for any market, this computes an epsilon stable outcome. And if the parameter is appropriately chosen, the amount of communication per agent is small. So it's square root n log n whenever the gamma ij's are independently distributed. And it matches the optimal logarithmic performance whenever the market is easy to match. So with an appropriate chosen parameter d, you can get the best of both worlds. However, here you have to choose this carefully based on your understanding of the distribution of preferences, which is why this is a harder to implement mechanism. So I just talked about the easy to match and the hard to match. Now let me talk about for thick markets, there's a simpler protocol you can do, which is centralized matching. Let me define a thick market. So a market is, the idea of a thick market is that no one is truly unique, but there's many, for any customer or provider, there are many similar participants that are like them. To formalize this, I assume that one side, say the providers, are partitioned into large segments where each segment is of a sufficient size. And here, since data is between 0 and 1, you could, with large n, you could still have many, many segments. It's just that you cannot have something like logarithmic size for each segment. The second assumption is that preferences are IID within segment. So for each customer I and provider J, the distribution of costs and benefits only depends on the segment of the provider J rather than the identity of the provider. This is saying that within a segment, providers look alike. The third one is that preferences are easy to satisfy on both sides, which is that the costs and the benefits are close to these optimistic estimates, so low cost, high benefit with at least a constant probability. And examples are like ride sharing, grocery delivery, and various standardized services in which you're happy to serve at least a constant proportion of the market. No one is that picky about their partners. And for these thick markets, here's an alternative near optimal protocol that has various desirable properties. So in this system, the platform assigns each customer to a provider segment by solving a certain linear program, which is basically a maximum assignment that uses these optimistic estimates, this matrix overbar beta as well as underbar C. These are the upper and lower supports. And this linear program determines the prices. And then the platform simply recommends a few providers from the assigned segment randomly. And with these recommendations, it allows both sides to veto the undesirable matches. So it's kind of like Home Advisor will send you a bunch of providers. If the provider doesn't like you, maybe they won't call you. And if you don't like them, you're just not going to respond to them. So this vetoing can happen in a decentralized way. But once we know who are the recommended matches that both sides have a reasonable tolerance for, then the platform computes a maximum cardinality assignment within the subgraph of match recommendations that were not vetoed by either side. And the theorem is that for any thick market, the above computes an epsilon stable outcome with high probability using log square bits of communication. So this is a log factor higher than the optimal for easy markets, which is log n. However, this system has upfront pricing and simultaneous communication. You know already, you don't have to wait for providers to tell you the quotes. You already know how much everything is going to cost. And without having to wait for people to respond makes this more efficient in practice. And so that are the near optimal matchmaking protocols. And the paper also goes on to several extensions that I won't go into much, which are the incentives of agents. So far I've assumed people will just comply to what the protocol tells them to do. But in the paper, I show that it's in everyone's best interest to comply. There's limited incentives to unilaterally deviate from the prescribed behavior. Also, so far, this is one-to-one matching, but many of these results extend to many-to-many matching naturally. And finally, you can define an analogous model without transfer payments. So closer to a stable matching model, but this is an epsilon stable matching. And in that model, you can show all of these results hold. So, so something that's shown here is more fundamental. The transfers are not that important. And in the world without transfers, instead of the platform coming up with cost estimates, it's the platform giving people expectation of whom they actually have a chance of getting. And I can talk more about the model without transfers at the end. Are there any questions, clarification question about the results before I conclude with a brief discussion?
Hi, yeah, I have a question. Can you talk about what would happen with the thick market protocol if you were to try to implement it on an easy to match or hard to match market? Or like, is it implementable at all? Or is there something that happens like one side or the other?
Oh, so the centralized matching protocol is provably efficient in a subset of easy to match. So thick markets are a subset of easy to match. So for example, Uber is like a thick market. Passengers don't care that much. Riders, drivers don't care that much. But Airbnb is not thick according to this definition because customers, you can't just match them to a random house in New York. They actually care about which particular place they look for. So in specialized markets, you can do something simpler, and centralized matching is optimal. However, if you try to use centralized matching when one side is picky or when both sides is picky as for hard to match markets, then the guarantees no longer hold. This will not give you this epsilon stable outcome. Does that answer the question? And it's another question to study, okay, what if you implement it anyway, how bad that is? That's not something I study here. Any other questions?
Peng, just out of curiosity, this the protocol for easy to match kind of reminds me of the iterative combinatorial auctions, where one side point to the bundle they like the most given the prices, and the other side gradually increases the prices. So I was just wondering, like about the proof techniques. Are we using something like similar to iterative algorithms for solving LPs, or is it very different? And so,
okay.
Other.
Yes. So the question is about like the relationship between this easy to match protocol, having the pickier side initiate contact and provide them with cost estimates with auction mechanisms. So it's a very good connection that because the protocol, if you read the paper, it's actually exactly based on the auction mechanism of Berteka's 1988 or Dimanche-Sotomayor 1986, which is this multi-item auction. So it is indeed implementing exactly the auctions. That's providers increasing their surplus, their price premiums based on demand. That's exactly an auction. What's different here is to analyze the communication aspects, which is not what is analyzed previously. So in some sense, the proof techniques are similar in terms of analyzing the auction, but different for analyzing these information theoretic perspective.
I see. That's super interesting. I'll take a look at the paper.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, so let me just conclude with a few discussing remarks about the managerial insights and future work. So the first managerial insights from this is that the optimal design depends crucially on this pickiness of preferences. When neither side is picky, you can do something like a centralized matching. When one side is picky, then you let the picky side search and initiate contact. And when both sides are picky, you need to allow both sides to initiate contact. So the right question to ask is about the pickiness of preferences. And that's something platforms should try to estimate. And I'll talk a little bit more about estimation on the next slide. The second managerial insight is that efficient matchmaking requires good price estimates. And this is something some platforms try to do, coming up with price estimates, but many platforms do not. So first, the paper highlights the importance of trying to come up with price estimates as much as we can in order to help the market to be more efficient. And the second point here is that a good price estimate is not minimizing root mean squared error, but it's looking at the optimistic but obtainable prices. In other words, I don't really care about the preferences of a random customer with a random provider. I care about the reason is that the actual matches are selecting high benefits and low costs. So trying to get accurate estimates of these at these low cost and high benefits range, that's the relevant metric to look at in terms of evaluating price estimates. And in order to take this to something implementable, there's some future work that needs to be done. One is to consider the issues of monetization. In this paper, I assume platforms just want to maximize social welfare or capture market share, but not about how they will make money. And the second, to make it implementable, is to develop statistical methodology for estimating the pickiness of preferences, so we know what platform design to choose, as well as for deriving these price estimates. And finally, it will be good to conduct a realistic empirical analysis for a particular platform. So here, item 2 and 3 will require partnering with a certain platform and have them share data. So if you have any contacts working at these platforms who may be interested, please let me know. And that concludes my talk, and I'll end here.
Thanks, Peng. We should give the last few minutes to John because he's prepared some comments. And I guess if somebody needs to leave, they can. But otherwise, we'll stay on a few minutes and listen to John's comments.
Yeah.
So I don't stop sharing.
No, I think why don't you just keep your slides up? I think I'll probably just talk through the points I have. So I haven't done any of these online seminars, but is there a point where we're supposed to clap collectively? Let's give Peng a round of applause off mute for a good job.
Thank you.
We don't get that social feedback, unfortunately. So one thing a couple thoughts I had on the kind of question about, you kind of put up HomeJoy as an example of a failure. And, one kind of story for why they failed was that they were just very, very subjected to disintermediation or circumvention. That sort of like once you formed a match on the marketplace, you could sort of just take your relationship offline. And so that kind of made me think about your framework in a dynamic setting where, like, one thing that's special about, say, Uber or Airbnb is that, my gamma keeps changing all the time. Like, I've never taken the same Uber ride twice. I've never stayed in the same Airbnb twice. And so that kind of compels me to go back to the marketplace and rematch constantly. Whereas HomeJoy, once you find out that you have a good match, you sort of never need to come back to the market again, right? Like you've found your pairing. And so I was thinking that, this may be partially a way to start thinking about circumvention and disintermediation, which is something that like occupies a lot of platform time and energy and thinking.
Okay, thanks. I think this is a very relevant comment. So this is the way I think about this mediation, which is providers and customers going and match on their own outside the platform, is about issue of monetization. So this is about how do we think about a match? So for example, finding a plumber, if I find a good plumber, I probably just call the plumber directly. I don't need the platform to look. So platforms such as Thumbtack, I was talking about to an executive here there recently. They mentioned how they think about the matches. they think about it as introducing two people together. So they charge huge amounts of money for these initial contacts. And their reasoning is that we're not going to try to monetize over previous later engagement. We're just trying to connect you in the first, make the first connection. So in that sense, part of the HomeJoy failure could be about monetization. They weren't able to really monetize their system. But this is a challenging research issue because how much can you monetize? So Thumbtack, people can be charged $75, $50 just for a lead, and the customer may not be that interested, maybe just ask a simple question, and then the platform counts that as a match, and you have to pay $75. This, on the forums, I find leads to a lot of dissatisfied providers thinks Thumbtack is just trying to rob them some message, and $75 goes out of my account. So this is a very tricky issue to think about how to do.
Yes. Another thing that was kind of raised was just this notion of things that are easy to predict, and you kind of have this definition, and I wonder how much we should think of the rise of online markets as sort of changes in the technology for estimating gamma. Like I kind of view like what made Uber possible was that everyone's carrying around a cell phone that's GPS enabled, and therefore like making that kind of rank ordering of sellers by gamma became sort of trivially easy. And then, you can create a market where one didn't exist. Whereas if you think about places where sort of gamma is still sort of hard to know. And like, I think of Upwork as sort of a classic, like hard to match. And it even meets your definition in that they allow sort of both forms of contact, right? There's both workers applying to jobs, but also employers can go out and search. And I think you've kind of hit on the economic reason why they have to allow both to exist. But it kind of raises this question of, to what extent do we see technological change as being about ways of inferring horizontal preferences, and then sort of like, what's next, right? Could you imagine different forms of instrumentation that would allow this kind of mechanism to happen that just doesn't exist right now?
Yeah, I think this is a very good point. So one way to interpret this is, okay, let's just horizontal preference, easy to predict, easy to satisfy, something exogenous. So if I'm easy to predict, yes, branch, okay, great. No branch, okay, tough luck. But another way to think about it is, again, this horizontal preference is based on what you already can infer from what people submit. So if I come up with a better machine learning algorithm to predict horizontal preferences, then I can turn something that's hard to match into something easy to match. And if I can do that on both sides, then I can do something even better with this centralized matching. So another way to think about this table is that it gives us direction about the importance of being able to better predict preferences, because that can help us go take a given market that's currently hard to match and make it easy to match, or even easy on both sides, by better questionnaires and better design. That's another dimension that that's very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates. And I think like with a lot of platforms, they face this kind of trade-off of how much pain they can put the user through in trying to elicit more of their preferences before they say, okay, well, we're going to do the best we can with what you have. I mean, if they didn't face any cost, they would have you fill out an hour-long survey to try to really kind of hone in on what they think that you care about. And in the Google Doc that was spread around, I put some examples of how Upwork does this. And you say you want a web development job, and then they ask you a whole sequence of questions, including some I'm responsible for, before they'll show you, even a kind of like a small subset of sellers. But I think that almost all platforms have to do this. In the Uber case, it's really straightforward because they get most of what they need to know just by the fact that you opened up your phone and they know where you are. But in these other marketplaces, it becomes it's much more challenging. And then I think that there's also this notion that there are certain kinds of markets where you may not even think of buyers and sellers as necessarily knowing, or at least the buyers as knowing their B. Like they know what they like, but they can't quite explain it, or it's an experience good, or they have a hard time sort of conveying what it is exactly what they're looking for. And I mean, on Upwork, at least, this is a huge issue of just a lot of the people want something done, but they don't even know the right terms to describe that thing to the other side of the market.
Yes, this is definitely. So I think I have two thoughts that's related to what you're saying. One thing is about this communication. So one way to interpret this model is about the communication overhead in certain markets. Another way you can think about it is it's about this communication is measuring how much information do you need to learn about your own preferences, because the bits you communicate, you only need to learn as many bits as you need to communicate. So in a hard to match market, this is also saying you need to figure out more about your preferences than easy to match. And when things are hard to describe, you need to go and look at more people, interview more people to figure out, versus if you are easy to satisfy, then you don't have to interview as many people. So this learning aspect is not directly incorporated, but it's at some level related. And then another comment about how should platforms think about it. One way, one perspective will be, okay, let's just try to get as much prediction power as we can. So for example, one major platform I was talking to recently said that their ideal is to go to a booking model where it's just like Uber. They're just going to make home services like Uber. You indicate your preferences, you write your availabilities and look at the price, and then bam, the platform matches. You don't have to go back and forth. And this paper is saying that is a good approach on average, because for many platforms, they are easy to predict or easy to satisfy. So something like that will work. And practically speaking, this centralized matching it has many appeals. However, what this paper is trying to say about that is that if you really do try to do that, there are certain, at least segments of the market that are more picky. So even if most home improvement jobs, most plumbing jobs are standard, there's certain people looking for specialized kind of jobs, and certain plumbers are good at certain specialized things. So you actually lose out on that part of market if you try to make everything very streamlined. So this is sort of saying, great, continue trying to predict everything, but leave some room in your platform design. If you want to capture the entire market, you need to leave some room for these hard to match people, because you cannot predict everything, even with technology. And this sort of also goes back to why there are many platforms in the home services space. Another way you can think about it is that this could be an efficient way in which hard to match people go to certain platforms that are more conducive to them, while the more standardized people go to platforms that just suggest a few people and you're happy anyway.
Right. I mean, just one thing that your comment made me think of is just my understanding in Airbnb. They have this Instabook option where you're a buyer, you can sort of just say, okay, I'm gonna stay at this place during these days. And my understanding is that one of the reasons why it's somewhat hard to get sellers to adopt it is if the seller feels there's something sort of peculiar about their property that they need to convey to the buyer first, like it's not safe for children, or something is kind of a little bit odd, and they don't want that reflected bad review. So there are some sellers who are essentially picky, even though I think your average characterization is they don't care, but there are enough that you need to have this other matching mechanism. It can't all just be Instabook. And so people can kind of sort to the kind of market design that sort of makes sense for, the nature of the thing that they're trying to buy or sell.
Yeah. I think you can combine these three, basically, just from the current preliminary work, it seems like it would be a good idea to have a platform where it's majority instant book, this centralized matching. But you also have options where one side can be picky, or even both sides be picky as other parts of your platform that people can sort to, and help actually educate people about, okay, if you're picky, then you probably don't want to use the instant book because you're just going to reject them ex post. You should just look here. And if you're a picky provider, you should play this way. So giving people more guidance about which features to use, but allowing different kind of capabilities could be one way to try to capture the majority of the market as well as these niche markets.